This is BSA by Design, a podcast about transforming healthcare, educational, and research facilities through expert design and insight. I'm your host, once again, Brian Moore. In this episode, we're going to explore neurodiversity in higher education, how institutions are addressing this need, challenges that students face, and things to consider during the planning process. My guest in this episode is Emmie Tyson. Emmie Tyson is a principal and architect at BSA's Raleigh studio. Emmie graduated from North Carolina State University with a Bachelor of Architecture degree and a Bachelor of Environmental Design and Architecture. She's a member of the AIA. Emmie is particularly interested in the design of human-centered spaces and how thoughtful design can improve learning and overall wellness. Welcome back to the show, Emmie.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
All right, let's jump into our conversation. Can you give our audience, and frankly me too, a brief explanation of neurodiversity and why it matters in higher education?
Sure. Neurodiversity really refers to the range of cognitive differences in how people perceive and think and learn. It encompasses a range of conditions, including things that are pretty well known, like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and then other lesser known cognitive or developmental variations like hyperlexia, which is early advanced reading skills, and synesthesia, which is, stimulation of one sense triggers experiences in a second unrelated sense. So these are really less talked about, but equally important.
Yeah.
So neurodiverse individuals, they experience and they interact with the environment differently. So they perceive sensory, social, and spatial cues in ways that are different from neurotypical peers. So what was interesting to me is an astonishing 15 to 20% of the global population is actually considered neurodivergent. And so in higher education, that really represents a growing and a vital segment of the campus population. So their success really depends on academic support and providing an environment that respects and accommodates their diverse sensory and emotional needs.
That's really interesting. Our youngest daughter was diagnosed with sensory at a young age, and she's since completely come out of it. And I know we're talking about higher ed here, but it was like, it's amazing how much just certain things would trigger her off and she could not focus, and the kind of techniques that you have to use. So I can see where that progresses as you age and you get into this. So why does this matter?
Well, within our design world, there are existing standards like the Americans with Disabilities Act, but that really primarily addresses physical accessibility and doesn't adequately consider sensory or cognitive access. And there are frameworks like universal design that offer some broad principles, but there remains a lack of really targeted, actionable design guidance that's specific to the needs of neurodiverse users. So, campuses really risk excluding a growing population of learners that truly bring valuable perspectives and creativity to the world. So I think what else is interesting that we found through this research is most of the design recommendations that we'll talk about don't just apply to neurodiverse students. They can improve learning outcomes for all students. So these considerations really can have broader impacts and implications for society. We can better equip all students for future success in the workforce. And we're really seeing advantages of diverse teams that are increasingly acknowledged and valued. All of the cognitive differences are valued in a way that they didn't used to be.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, we're not talking about the 15 to 20% is a large swath of people. So it's not like this is, we're trying to cater to 1 to 2% of the population, though that would be important too. It's a wide swath, right?
Yeah. It's actually, those numbers are staggering. And in some universities, they're seeing up to 30% of their students identify or, have cognitive differences that fall within the neurodiverse framework.
Interesting. So what's your journey kind of been in terms of learning so much about this and gaining some expertise on it?
Well, it started at a couple conferences where I saw a few people speak about this and some research that was actively ongoing. But my interest really lies in the why we're designing our projects. We're not just designing buildings, we're providing environments where students and faculty should thrive. These students should feel welcome, they should feel safe. So there's a lot of awareness in the world today of how we can embrace these differences, and our design world should be no different. We should be thinking about how we are designing for all students and not just the majority. So I was interested in this topic, so I engaged our director of research, Zara, and one of our lead designers to help us communicate this visually, Elizabeth. And they really helped me to dig in and find out what's out there. So together we've created design guidelines around designing for inclusivity in higher education.
Oh, that's interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of neurodiversity in higher ed. What does research tell us about neurodivergent student populations?
Well, like I said, they're a growing and vital part of the campus population. I think what is interesting as we were digging into the design considerations is institutions are starting to address this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. But many of the dated campuses aren't adequately equipping these students with spaces that meet their needs. So they're struggling to find spaces and groups of students that they can relate to. So I think awareness needs to grow and has been growing, and they need to feel represented.
Absolutely. My daughter's a sophomore in college. I will not say where, but you were talking about some of the spaces. Her dorm room freshman year, it was built in the early 60s, and it's like tiny. It feels very cinder block. It had no air conditioning. Like, this is not the greatest of learning environment. I mean, she survived and she's great. And now she's moved on to another place on campus, right? But I remember moving her in last year and thinking like, phew, I don't even remember it being like this, 25 years ago. So along those lines, right, how are institutions currently addressing, or I guess failing to address, neurodiversity?
Well, I think many students are still experiencing what researchers term the hidden curriculum. So this is where unspoken institutional expectations really force these students to mask their differences. So this can result in exhaustion, identity disconnection, and compromised mental health. So there's a wide range of institutions that are already integrating design considerations for neurodiverse students.
Yeah.
And there are some that are designing in a positive way without even knowing it. Like they're doing some of the things that we'll talk about, even without awareness of some of the outcomes that they can improve. So there are more and more conferences and awareness of this issue. So momentum is growing.
So when you say they're doing it, not even knowing it, they're kind of stumbling upon the right answer and they don't even know. I'm curious to get into some of that. What are some of the most common challenges faced by neurodivergent students?
So overstimulation seems to be a really common trait. And as I mentioned earlier, the range of cognitive differences is vast. So there are some commonalities, there are some differences between them, but overstimulation is really common. Feeling overwhelmed, unsafe, and uncomfortable are all really common for neurodiverse individuals. So sometimes on college campuses, it's hard to find spaces that make them feel comfortable, kind of like your daughter. The
Right.
trend of residence halls is they're creating more spaces around wellness, and really thinking about the whole individual. And so these students will often disengage, their test scores will suffer, and all of this kind of compounds into affecting their overall student experience and general wellness. So much like neurotypical students, these students want to belong, they want to feel a sense of community, and they want to feel safe.
I feel like when you talk about feeling overwhelmed, unsafe, and uncomfortable, that makes me think like overstimulation equals fatigue to me, right? You get tired of dealing with it. So are places of respite a key part of some of our solutions?
They are. So we're going to talk a little bit. I want to talk first about the outcomes that we're trying
Okay.
to achieve because I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, what I want to focus on today is around spatial planning because those are the things
Yep.
that are harder to change later. So if we can think about this early in design, there's really not a cost impact to thinking about areas of respite, thinking about the sensory experience, how you zone the building so that these students have places where they can get away after they're overstimulated. So we'll talk
Right.
about all of that.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about how architecture's role in supporting neurodiversity. How does physical space impact learning for neurodivergent students?
Well, we started to touch on this, but a student's environment can lead to both overstimulation and understimulation.
Oh,
So that can lead to disengagement and poor learning outcomes. So at the root of it with learning, it can impact how students retain information and then also how they engage with their classmates. So some of the positive outcomes we're looking to achieve by designing thoughtfully include predictability, autonomy, engagement, focus, comfort, and regulation, among a few others. So what does that mean exactly? Predictable environments, they reduce uncertainty and anxiety for students.
yep.
So we'll talk about that a little bit with wayfinding and how you plan a building. Autonomy enables students to self-direct their experience, giving them control over their environments and control over their interactions. Engagement is exactly what you think it means. Students are
Right.
feeling empowered and encouraged to participate both actively and inactively. Regulation is the ability of students to manage their emotional and sensory responses to their surroundings. And then safety is both physical protection, which is obviously very important, but also emotional security within the campus. So all of these outcomes are important for both neurodivergent students and faculty, but also, like we talked about earlier, the neurotypical population. So really the design strategies that we're talking about are important for the entire campus.
Yeah, and I'm laughing because some of these probably apply to me, and I'm in my mid-40s. Like you mentioned predictable. I've noticed for a long time now, I prefer to record at home as we're doing right now because I'm in my own, like I know my environment, right? If there's been a few times I've recorded in a studio, it's like I can't control the noise and like who's going to maybe open a door that they shouldn't and like interrupt us, and everything. So I definitely feel like I fall into that predictable camp. It reduces my uncertainty and anxiety to know where I'm recording.
Funny, that seems to happen as you get older too.
Right, right.
You
We're
also
talking about we're talking about college age kids, and I'm like, well, that applies to me, and I'm long past that. So
just a few years. Come on.
right, right. So, what design principles have kind of proven most effective?
So we kind of boiled this down to 5 categories of considerations in design, which include spatial planning, nature integration, interiors, wayfinding, and technology. And within that, there's several different things to consider within each category. But I want to note this isn't really a one-size-fits-all strategy. This isn't a prescriptive thing. So every project is different, and they need to be evaluated early on, and the priorities need to be set by the project team and the owner because it may not make sense for every project.
Right.
But today, I'd like to focus most heavily on spatial planning because, like I said earlier, these are the items that need to happen early in a project, and they're the most difficult and most expensive to change later. So getting the pieces and parts in place first, they don't add cost, they only require early critical thinking.
Okay.
So within the spatial planning category, spatial sequencing, sensory zoning, and escape zones can contribute to some of the outcomes we talked about earlier. Spatial sequencing is the logical order and arrangement of spaces based on their function and their privacy. So we want to design intuitive one-way routes or simple loops with few decision points. We
Right.
can reinforce those decision points with material shifts, ceiling changes, and really having consistent corridor widths helps with predictability. So how this integrates into the design process, really thinking about the user's journey and mapping that out on paper to organize spaces in a clear sequence that minimizes backtracking and promotes functional flow. And this is what I was talking about. I think many projects are already doing this,
Yeah.
but we don't always draw it out. We don't always think about different scenarios and the student and how they interact with certain spaces. So I think clients need to be encouraging their design teams to really think through this and help them map out every experience.
Yep. I've talked to Jim Worley and Justin Beadle a little bit on a previous episode about some journey mapping exercises that we try to do, especially from, like you said, an interiors perspective. So that sheds a little more light on it.
Yeah, we're also starting to do some behavior mapping after the spaces are designed to benchmark, well, how did this really perform. So that's another way to see how we
Yeah.
do this initially in planning, but then let's also measure how it's actually performing. So sensory zoning, I wanted to talk about as well. It's the organization of environments based on levels of sensory input. So that's sound, light, movement, anything that affects the senses. And so this can be achieved by classifying environments into high, moderate, and low stimulation zones. So some of the design recommendations are using vestibules, alcoves, partitions to physically separate spaces such as gyms or louder spaces, corridors, and quiet rooms. So we really want to prevent that sensory overlap and overstimulation. We want to avoid blending the simulation. We want to avoid blending stimulation levels without defined boundaries. So don't have these different levels of sensory senses open to each other. And then you can really reinforce the identity of each zone with environmental cues. So kind of like we talked about with the predictability, flooring transition, ceiling height changes, variation. So that helps with the predictability and legibility for the students.
Right.
So related to this, and this has been tested out on a few campuses, but wouldn't it be interesting if we provided a map of these sensory zones, very similar to an evacuation map that you see in a building? So it would be a visual representation of the spatial planning strategies that we just talked about. So it could be on the wall and it highlights the different sensory experiences. So you could call out quiet zones or areas of low light so that the student can come in and get directly to those spaces based on, where they are that day. So, and apps could help support that too. Students could, know before they walk in the building exactly where they need to be or where they want to be.
That would probably help with the anxiety piece, right? Like if I'm able to look it up on an app before I even get there, now I feel a little more settled and comfortable. So that makes sense.
And then lastly, I wanted to talk about escape spaces. They're small, quiet, low stimulation areas that allow students or faculty to withdraw from the overstimulation that we talked about earlier, and allows them to self-regulate their emotions. So the key is to embed these escape spaces near high activity zones like libraries or student centers or even large lecture halls. So you can look at this on the campus level, but also on the building level. So when a student gets out of a high stimulation area that is part of the learning experience, giving them a place to quickly escape outside of those areas and decompress is really important. And, truly those spaces can double as collaboration zones and things.
Right.
So many campuses are already doing this, but not necessarily calling it an escape zone, or maybe they're not treating it acoustically, well to make it a quiet zone, but the space is already there. So I think there are ways that we can think about some of these recommendations, providing multiple benefits, an area for students to collaborate, but also escape, which makes it even more viable within the budget. And then there are other considerations around interior finishes and acoustic strategies that should all be considered, but we can save that for a later discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the common obstacles in implementing neurodiverse design solutions? Are there cost considerations, I'm assuming?
I really think the most common obstacles are time in the design process and then a lack of expertise. This is really a relatively new subject and newer research. So it takes time, for one, to see the full benefits and the outcomes of the solutions being implemented in a measurable way. But if these things are considered early, there shouldn't be a cost add for making these decisions during design. The planning strategies that we talked about are really around organizing elements that were already planned for the building. So they shouldn't have a cost add. And then some of the finishes, we really want to have muted tones and muted colors, not large expanses of really bold colors. Those are as simple as making the right material choices. So if we talk about this early and we're not trying to change things after things have already started construction, there really shouldn't be a cost add for considering these.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, I know you mentioned this is a somewhat new subject and relatively new with some of the research. But if anybody's ever listened to an episode of this podcast, you probably know this question is coming. I like talking about the future trends. So do you see any future trends or innovation in this space?
Well, I do think that awareness on this topic is growing. There is quite a bit of research out there, which is exciting.
Yeah.
I think that building codes haven't caught up to that yet. So I think and hope in the future that building codes and architectural firms will increasingly include guidelines around sensory friendly design. Multi-sensory learning will hopefully no longer be limited to special needs. It will really
Oh,
be
yeah.
mainstreamed. And then student voice and lived experience will shape inclusive policy. So, I mean, really having these students a seat at the table in design could be transformative. So I really hope that neuro-inclusive design will be measurable, it'll be fundable, and professionally recognized in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a seat at the table. If you're just talking with your earlier number about 15 to 20%, that's 1 in 5 that experience this. And like you said, on some campuses, it could be 30%, which is obviously even more. So I think that's a really, really good point. Okay, final thought. What are some recommendations you have for institutions looking to do better and support neurodiversity?
Well, I think awareness at the leadership level of a campus. I think there needs to be buy-in on pushing this on a campus and making sure design teams are aware of it as well. So I think awareness is the first step. As I mentioned, there are not really published standards on the topic. So
Mm.
doing your own research, informing your designers that this is something that's important to the institution, or selecting designers that think it's important or have guidelines around this can really go a long way in ensuring that this is considered in the design process as decisions are being made. So I mean, first and foremost, I think awareness and deciding whether this is important to the institution.
Awesome. Well, I think you've done a really good job of covering this in a broad spectrum, and maybe in the future you can come back on to dive into another section a little bit deeper. I always enjoy talking to you though, so thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Brian.
I'd like to thank Emmie again for joining me on this episode of BSA by Design. You can connect with her on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about BSA and designing for neurodiversity in higher education, we encourage you to visit our website at bsadesign.com. There's a link in the show notes to contact us for more information. Be sure to subscribe to BSA by Design on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube Music so you don't miss an episode. And be sure to check out BSA on social media, including LinkedIn and YouTube. That will do it for this episode. Join us again next time on BSA by Design.